Hi, this is Scott with ClaySys. What we'll be taking a look at today with this demonstration are some of the different ways that you can add data to a drop-down box or what is commonly called a combo box using ClaySys AppForms. Now, we have the standard methods of doing that. What I mean by that are the ability to manually add items. Those are called static values. That option is there. The most popular way is to add items through a data source, maybe coming from a SharePoint list, SQL Server table, web service, something of that nature. That option is also there. But one of the very cool features with ClaySys AppForms is the ability to add items using a rule. And if you've done any work with InfoPath in the past, you know that that functionality is just simply not available. You can add them manually, you can get them from a data source, but that's it. If you wanted to use a rule to add items based upon some action in your form, it's just simply not available. And with ClaySys AppForms, that functionality is indeed there. So let's take a look at some of the different ways. The form I have for our demonstration today is 4 different drop-down boxes. Each of those is going to represent a different way of adding items to that particular drop-down box. So the first way we'll take a look at is manually, commonly called static values. So if I go over here to the right to our Properties panel, you'll see that CBO Cities 1 is selected. I'll select Data Source here and click the ellipses next to Items. So when this screen launches, you'll see that by default, static is the option that is selected. So we can just simply start typing values in here, and this will be your list of items for that particular drop-down box. So if I click OK to that and preview the form, you will see that that drop-down box contains those 3 items. It's that simple. Okay, the next way to add items to your drop-down box is probably the most popular, and that's to pull the items or to pull that data from some type of data source. SharePoint list, again, SQL Server table, whatever it may be. For this demonstration today, we're going to be using a SharePoint list that I have on my Office 365 tenant. The list is called Cities. The same 3 cities are in that list, Atlanta, Baltimore, and Charlotte. So let's take a look at setting that up. So we'll select the second drop-down box. Once again on the right, the Properties panel, I'll expand Data Source, click the Items option here. And instead of doing static this time, I'll go down to the bottom here and choose SharePoint. This is selecting where the data is coming from. So it's SharePoint for me. I'll click OK. This just shows you the site collection that we're coming from, or site that we're coming from here using ClaySys. So I'll just click Next. Here, this would show you all the available lists or libraries on your site. So there is my cities list. I'll select that and click Next. Now this screen allows you the ability to add criteria. In other words, to filter the data that comes back to your drop-down box. So if you wanted to only, for instance, show cities from a specific state or something of that nature, you could do that. In this case, for this demonstration, I want to bring back all the records, so we'll leave everything here as it is and simply click Next. Now this screen, you have the ability to show the user one thing, but store something else once they make a selection. Let me explain that a bit further. As you know, each item in a SharePoint list or library contains an item ID value that SharePoint assigns automatically. Well, you may have a scenario where you want to show the user, let's say, the name of the city, so that it's obvious to them what it is. So we'll call that the display member. That will be displaying within the title field, which will be the city name. But once they make a selection, maybe what you want to store is the list item ID for what they've selected. And if you want to do that, you would go to the ID column here and select value member. So now, once this form would open and the user makes a selection from the drop-down box, let's say they select Atlanta, then what would be stored in the underlying data would be the actual SharePoint list item ID for Atlanta. Now, whether or not you do it this way, or what is also popular is just storing and showing the same thing, which is what I'll do here, that's really a design choice. So to get to the scenario where you show a value and store the same thing, you simply choose both for title. So once the user, in my case, makes a selection, let's say Atlanta, from the drop-down box, what we will store is also the word Atlanta. Okay, so we'll choose both for that title and click Next. Now, when do we want this data to be there? We're adding a trigger at this point. Well, we want this data to be there when the form loads. So we'll click the Add Trigger button. And these are the various triggers that you have built in. We'll choose Form Load, select the Create Rule button, and I'll show you in a moment. This actually creates a rule to go execute a connection to fetch that data and put it back into our drop-down box called CBO City 2. So let's click Create Rule. The other option here on this screen is, do we want to sort the data? And most of the times you do. Make it easy for the user to select what they need. So we'll choose Title so that we're sorting by, in essence, the city name. We will sort ascending, and you click the Add button to actually add that sort order. All right, and we're done. So we'll click Finish. So before we preview this and test it, let's switch over to the Rule tab for a moment. And here you will see that a rule was created called onFormLoad. So when this form loads, we will call this built-in function called fillDataSync. This is what is typically called to fill data into a control, like a drop-down box or a list box, something of that nature. So we fill data, sync is the function. We pass it the control that we want to fill, and then based upon those selections that we made through that wizard of the data source, it will fill the items into our drop-down box called CBO Cities 2. All right, so let's go preview that and test it. So the first drop-down box, again, this was our static values, the ones that we hard-coded in. And now this one here, there are 3 values coming from the SharePoint list called cities. Okay, so these two are extremely popular ways of getting data into a drop-down box. These work also very well in InfoPath form as an example, the same way you get them either hard-coding them in, typing them in, or getting them from a data source. But the cool feature of ClaySys AppForms, once again, is the ability to add items to a drop-down box or a list box, something of that nature, using a rule. Let's take a look at that now. So I'll close this preview. So the CBO Cities 3, I'm going to show you how that we can add items, the same 3 cities, to this box using a rule. And we're going to add that from this button here called Add Items Individually. So I'll select the button. I'll go over here to the Properties panel again. This time I'll select Rules. I'll drop down to Rules and choose Create Rule. So that creates us a new rule. We'll just leave that name for now. And we, again, have a built-in function. I'll add an action here. And that function name is called AddItems. And this is what is used to add items to a drop-down box, list box, something of that nature. So with the AddItems function, we pass it the control name of where we want to add the items. So in this case, CBO Cities 3. And then we also then pass it what value we want to add. All right, so those are Atlanta. So I'll do this just really quick for Baltimore and Charlotte as well. All right, and finally one more. We'll add Charlotte. Okay, so you're probably thinking, how is this different than adding them statically or manually like we did for the first drop-down box? And to be quite honest, doing what we're doing here, it's really not much different, right? You're just doing them through a rule instead of putting it into the drop-down box. But I want you to just hold on to that thought for a moment, because the next option I'm going to show you is how this becomes so powerful. All right, so let's make sure this works. Let's preview our form. Once again, our hard-coded static values coming from our cities list in SharePoint, and click this button, and now there are the 3 items that I added through the rule. Okay, so at this point in time, you are correct. Option 3 here and option 1 are virtually the same thing. But let's see how this can become so powerful with ClaySys AppForms. So I've got this 4th drop-down box here called CBO Items, and this one now I'm going to populate through this button called Add Items Loop. Now this is where we get to be really quite powerful by being able to add items in a loop using a rule. You don't have to do this through code. It is simply through using a rule in ClaySys AppForms. So let's take a look at how we do that. So once again, I'm going to go over here to our rules and choose Create Rule. And again, I'll leave this one as New Rule 1. So to add items in a loop, you have to think about this. Your loop is going to execute how many times? Well, that's going to be depending upon your design. So for what we're doing here for this demo, we're adding 3 cities each time. So I'm going to have my loop execute 3 times. So the way that you do that in a rule is through a counter, commonly called a variable. So if I click Create Variable, you'll see that I have a variable here called var counter. A variable name can be anything that you like. If you wanted to call it iCounter, it makes no difference. You create a name that makes sense to you, give it that name, and click on Save Variable. That's what I did here to get my var counter variable created. All right, so the first thing that we're going to do when we click this button is we want to set that variable called var counter. We have to instantiate it with some value. So let's add an action, and our action here will be setting var counter equal to 1. Okay. Now, how many times do we want this rule to execute? Remember, we want this for our particular demonstration to only execute a total of 3 times. So we have to check, is the counter at or below the number 3, right? Because if it's above 3, we don't want to execute it anymore. So the next thing we have then is a decision. We want to check and make sure the number stored in that var counter is less than or equal to 3. So that's our condition. As long as it is less than or equal to 3, then we want to continue to populate the items in that last drop-down box. So what we'll do here is, as long as we're less than or equal to 3, we're going to create a new rule. We'll call this rule AddItems. So as long as we're under 3, the next action from this condition will be to call this rule. Let's give this an action of AddItems now. So now we're looking at what we were doing in the third demonstration a moment ago. We'll be putting this in our CBO items dropdown. And just for ease right now, I'm going to call the items that I add the word item and then whatever the counter number is. So the first time through, you'll see this adding item 1, the second time item 2, and then item 3. Okay. Actually, I did that wrong. I don't want to hard code that. It's got to be what's in the counter. Okay. So now we come through our rule, we add the item. The next step is we have to increment our counter. So let's do that. So we'll just add 1 to it. So that takes whatever was in there and adds 1 to that value. So if it was 1, we now take it and add 1 to it. So it's 2 and then 3, so on and so forth. Okay. Now finally, if we are less than 3, we're going to add a new action to our decision here. And this decision, or I'm sorry, this action is going to be to run this rule that I've just created up here. And we can select that rule. You can see it shows up there in my IntelliSense, my dropdown. All right, so let's take a look at this just briefly for a moment. We're not completely done yet, but let's stop here for a moment and review what we have. So let's assume for a second that the form is open. I'm going to be clicking this button called AddItems Loop. What's going to happen? We're going to come in here to new rule 1. We're going to instantiate or set our counter initially to a value of 1. Then, as long as our counter is less than 3, we're going to run this rule, this sub-rule, which will have an action of adding items to our drop-down box called CBO items. And what it'll add is the word item and then whatever number the counter is at. Once that action runs, our next action is to increment the counter. We go from 1 to 2, then 2 to 3. And then finally, this action here, this run rule, is actually tied to our condition. So as long as we're less than or equal to 3, we're going to run this rule, which is this rule here. So now we're in this loop. I hope that makes sense. So the last thing that we have to do is just kick off this rule here, the rule that actually adds our items, the sub rule. We want to kick that off at least once. So we'll go back up to our new rule 1, click add action, and here we're just going to run rule. And we're going to run our sub-rule. So to finalize this now, we click the button, we instantiate our counter to 1. We then absolutely want to run our rule once. So this rule calls our, or this action I should say, calls our sub-rule here called AddItems. We add the first item, we increment the counter, and now we're at a point where we have a condition. Are we less than 3? Yes. If we are, we now run this action of run the rule, which repeats this sub-rule here again until we get to 3. And then our rule will stop. All right, so let's take a look at that. We'll preview our form. And finally, our hard-coded items, static values, coming from our SharePoint list. Here's where I add them individually, one at a time through the AddItems command. And finally, our loop. And you can see now I have item 1, 2, and 3. So these last two are the really powerful features of ClaySys AppForms that can allow you to dynamically add items to a drop-down box using a rule. And you can even put that rule into a loop so that based upon values that a user might enter in your form elsewhere, you can kick off this sub-rule to add those items to your drop-down box. I hope you found this video to be beneficial. We are going to be producing more of these how-to type videos in the coming weeks and months, so be sure to check our website often for new demonstrations. You can find all of our videos at http://www.claysys.com/pages/viewdemo.aspx. If there is a video you would like to see that is currently not on our site, please let us know by sending an email to info@claysys.com, and we will do our best to get one created for you. Again, I hope you found this video to be of benefit, and thank you for using ClaySys AppForms.